A Star of Ash, A Child of Magic, a novel by Parker James. Chapter 1. The First Day of a Long Year. Now. It was early in the morning. The sun had yet to rise past the cloud-breaking Tower of Babel on the horizon, and the air was cold from the autumn night. Nearly every day, Freya and her father woke up at this time and ventured deep into the woods, away from their town. When they walked through the woods, her father would carry her on his bony back, and she would wrap her arms around his neck. Although this was daily routine for Freya, she was always still sleepy. When the birds sang, Freya had little chance to stay awake. At this hour, their songs would sound like lullabies. Coupled with the soothing sounds of the stream, she was practically napping. The woods always looked peaceful, even through the darkness of the early morning, almost as if it were still asleep, and the rustling of the leaves was its way of snoring. Freya wished her father would feel the same way, though she understood why he didn't. He taught her well to be afraid of the Sanctus Venatores. When they ventured farther, her father would stop every few minutes to look around, especially if something was scurrying behind them. Sometimes Freya had needed to remind him where they were, but he was fairly present today. After what Freya had guessed was an hour, she and her father finally made it to their clearing. In this empty space, there were stones and old torn-up scarecrows. Freya and her father would use them as practice dummies, placed in arrangements of groups and individuals. Her father made sure Freya was awake before setting her down. She was not up to his waist yet, though few adults were up to his head. This was further exacerbated by her father always wearing his big, black, pointed hat. He once told Freya that they were called scholar hats, but Freya was sure he only wore the oversized thing because it kept people away. Her father moved toward the stones and practice dummies and made some quick changes and fixes to ensure they were in the right place for today. Freya rubbed her eyes and looked for her favorite tree stump to sit on while she waited for her father to prepare everything for practice. Freya tucked her whole body into her large dark purple robe like her own little tent, keeping herself warm. The sun had started to peek out over the tower when her father had finished setting everything up. The woods were showered in bright golden sunlight. Her father called for her, so she popped out of her robe tent and ran to him as fast as she could, nearly tripping over herself in excitement when she was finally getting more awake now. Freya faced the 4 scattered stones as she stood next to her father. Her father knelt down so she could talk to Freya eye to eye. He spoke to her, his voice hoarse but gentle and quiet, with an accent like no one else in town.
"All right, Veman, let us work on more finer control today."
He pointed to the stones and continued.
"I rounded the stones yesterday. They will not have any flat sides. Try to stack as many of them as you can. Keep the spell simple and take as much time as you need."
He paused, briefly.
"Remember, you do not need to use your hands. That is just in your head."
Freya nodded energetically. She prepared herself by keeping balance, her body relaxed. Freya focused on the rock closest to her. In half a second, Freya had mentally measured everything she needed to know about the stone. The size, density, mass, and the current force of gravity, all down to the exact decimal, as assigned to it by the rules of reality. She configured the rules for how gravity would work on the stone, adjusting the pole in different directions, allowing the rock to vibrate and slightly hover above the ground as the pull of gravity on it was just as strong as the natural gravity holding it down. Magic of this school caused an effect of a pale blue ring that illuminated and encircled Freya's feet, rotating and pulsating. Within the radiant ring, symbols and equations appeared, matching the ones in her head, reverberating with the same rhythm as the ring itself. Freya thought of another configuration, and then another symbol formed on the ring. The rock she focused on was pulled toward another stone. It appeared there was an error in Freya's configuration, as the pull was too strong, causing it to move too fast and overshoot its target. Freya nearly dropped it in her panic to overcorrect. When Freya tried to fix the rock's course, she forgot to keep the configuration and lost the upward pull, causing it to fall back down too low and knocking over the rest of the pile. Freya let out a huff of frustration, and just barely avoided stomping like she used to when she was younger.
No, this is too hard. I am not ready to use gravomancy without my hands.
Freya thought as she reached out her arm and used her hand to guide the second rock. This time, she was able to pull the rock with far greater control and successfully stacked it on top of the first stone. The third and fourth stones took more time to stack, even with her hands as a focus. By the time Freya had finished, the sun was barely out. When Freya released her control over the final stone, the ring around her faded. She took a deep breath of chilled air before turning to her father. Her father gave Freya a mirthful smile through the shadow cast on his face by his big pointed hat.
I'm sorry, Papa,
Freya said, pacing back and forth and trying not to let her frustration show. Her father gently patted her head.
It is all right, Vian. We are in no hurry. Magic is altering the rules of reality. It is not a physical task, but a mental one.
But how am I supposed to control it if I can't use my hands?
Vian, you are not actually holding the rocks with your hands.
I know, but it feels like I am.
For Freya, it was easy to comprehend the changes needed to do a lifting spell in gravimancy. Even spells lifting heavy objects around weight made sense to her, even if it was harder. Trying to do something so precise, such as rotating them, did not. There were numerous changes to keep track of and focus on, especially when she can't use her hands to remind her what she is doing.
Why can't I figure this out? Papa is able to do it all the time, so I know it's possible. Am I not smart enough? What is wrong with me?
I'm sure you'll understand with enough practice. We're not in a rush,
her father said as he scanned the area once more. Freya looked up at him with big brown eyes that mirrored her father's.
Papa, since I finished early, could I please do quick throws before we leave?
She asked, hoping they could have a bit more fun before going to school. He looked back down at her and nodded. Freya joyfully ran back to the stones and faced the scarecrows. Now this exercise was easy for her. All she had to do was levitate each rock and configure the rules to launch them at the scarecrow as fast as she could and in quick succession. Using a similar spell from earlier, Freya pointed her hand at the stone and hovered it in the air. She whipped it at the scarecrow, hitting one of its arms and causing it to spin rapidly. She pulled another stone from the stack and flung it again, this time grazing the head of the scarecrow. For the last two stones, Freya decided to pick up both at once and threw them one after the other. The first one missed and slammed into a nearby tree, causing splinters to scatter while finches soared off from their perch. The final rock hit the center of its straw chest and knocked it flat on the ground. When Freya had finished, she looked back at her father. He pulled something from one of the bags tied to his belt. It was a small vial of azure liquid her father had made. She hadn't realized her mind had clouded until she recognized the potion as Zaltrout. He took a sip of it himself, waited, testing it before letting Freya have some. She began to drink it as soon as he handed it to her. Zaltrout doesn't have a taste, much like water, yet had a thickness that made Freya gag each time she drank it. Knowing this, her father had mixed in various fruits to try to give it a better taste, hoping it would be easier for her to drink it, and it worked for the most part. As she drank, the usual coolness of the liquid Zaltrout splashed the back of her throat, and it tasted like peaches today. Freya chugged down faster, trying to taste more of her favorite flavor. As the cloudiness in her mind receded, Freya realized if she hadn't taken the potion today, she would have been lucky if she could recall how to spell her own name. She must have been overcomplicating her spell if it gotten this bad.
Could you do the exercise, Papa? I want to see how you would do it,
Freya asked. If it just so happened to stall time from getting to school, then it would be merely a happy coincidence, according to Freya. Her father looked past her and at the stones for a brief moment. He pointed toward where the stones had been, and Freya turned to see all 4 stones restacked and balanced in what appeared to be impossible angles. Freya's eyes widened. Freya had watched her father the whole time. Not even for a moment did it look like he was doing anything. Freya didn't hear a single stone move, nor had she noticed the glowing ring that should have surrounded him whenever they used magic. Freya turned back to her father and looked at him dumbfoundedly. He smiled again and headed back toward town. She gazed at the stones one last time before running after him. When she caught up, Freya and her father walked side by side along the dirt path as she drank her potion. Freya's eyes wandered around the now brightly lit woods. It appeared to be glowing with amber orange and golden yellow, the effects of which made her teal, waist-length hair pop out in contrast. All the animals were now wide awake. Squirrels scurried across the oak tree branches. Deer trotted around them, and a brown-furred mama bear took her cubs out to gather berries. After a couple of minutes, Freya finished her drink and handed the empty vial back to her father. Freya grabbed her father's gloved hands and swung his long arms back and forth as they walked along the dirt trail. On the way, they passed a group of tiny, pointy-chinned and pointy-eared cluricans. the nocturnal cousins of the leprechauns. They were singing an unintelligible song and drinking what her father called potions only for grown-ups. They were returning to their homes deep in the woods after a long night of working at the Starboard Tavern. Up ahead, they walked under one of the signs outside of town that arched only 2 feet above them. "Welcome to Valor" was written on it. Not too far from where they stood, yet away from the rest of the town, lay their little wooden hilltop house.